Final Fantasy XIII, a game that sits with a surprisingly solid Metacritic score of 83, is still one of the most controversial titles in the Final Fantasy series. It sparked debates, passionate love, and even more passionate hate, making it one of the most divisive RPGs in recent memory. But here's the big question. Is Final Fantasy XIII really that bad, or has it been misunderstood all this time? In this video, we're going to break down what worked, what didn't, and whether it deserves its infamous reputation. Released in 2009, Final Fantasy XIII marked a bold new direction for the Final Fantasy franchise. After the massive success of Final Fantasy X and the open world experimentation of 12, expectations were high. And yet 13 landed in the hands of gamers with a thud, met with mixed reviews and divided opinions. Fans loved its cinematic ambition and the stunning visuals, while others found its gameplay restricting and its story needlessly convoluted. But after all these years, is it possible that 13 has been unfairly criticized? Or maybe is the game's criticism justified? To understand why Final Fantasy XIII has been so polarizing, we have to start with its most commonly cited criticism: linearity. For many, the most glaring flaw in the game is that for the first 20 plus hours, players are confined to a narrow, straight path with little opportunity to explore. This was a stark contrast to what fans had come to expect from previous Final Fantasy titles, where large open worlds invited players to roam freely, uncover hidden treasures, stumble upon side quests, and immerse themselves in lore that deepened the world building. This sense of freedom was not just a feature, but a defining element of the series' legacy. Gamers were expecting an open world experience akin to Final Fantasy XII, but instead they got long stretches of narrow pathways filled with enemies, scripted battles, and many cutscenes. This limited exploration not only narrowed the gameplay, but also restricted the ways players could interact with the game's story and characters. As you funnel down these linear paths, the experience feels less like navigating a rich world and more like progressing through a carefully controlled storyline, almost like a rail shooter rather than a traditional RPG. This structure had significant consequences on how players experienced the story. With no room to explore or backtrack, players missed out on the gradual, organic discovery of characters and storylines that had once been central to the franchise. Many players felt the linearity reduced Final Fantasy XIII to an extended tutorial, one that held their hand far too long without a rewarding payoff. There's no village to stumble upon, no hidden side quest to uncover, no opportunity to really connect with the world outside of the main plotline. In the end, this restricted approach left many fans feeling disconnected from a series that had once prided itself on vast, immersive worlds. Final Fantasy XIII also faced criticism for its abundance of cutscenes. One fan summed it up perfectly by saying it's more movie than game. This sentiment echoed throughout the player base as long stretches of exposition-heavy cutscenes slowed the game's pace to a crawl. While the visuals were undeniably breathtaking with cinematic quality far ahead of its time, this constant emphasis on storytelling through cutscenes came at a cost: the active gameplay experience itself. These cutscenes often lasted several minutes, breaking up gameplay and leaving players in the position of a passive observer. Rather than weaving the story into the player's actions, the game leaned heavily on cinematic sequences to communicate its complex plot. Players frequently found themselves watching characters interact rather than controlling them, leading to a sense of disconnection. In other RPGs, cutscenes are typically balanced with interactive sequences where players can explore or make meaningful choices that impact the story. Here, however, the relentless stream of cutscenes made it difficult to stay engaged, with many players feeling as though they were simply along for the ride. Critics argued that this approach sacrificed the essence of what makes a game engaging: interaction and player agency. By opting to tell so much of the story through non-interactive sequences, Final Fantasy XIII created an experience where players were less involved in the narrative than they wanted to be. The immersive quality that fans had loved in earlier Final Fantasy titles, where they could wander, discover, and influence the world, was replaced by lengthy cinematics that make the game feel more like a movie marathon than an adventure. And while the cutscenes were visually impressive, many fans felt they could have been shorter or better integrated, preserving the momentum and interactivity that define a memorable RPG experience. And then there's the issue of character development. Despite having a full roster of playable characters, many fans felt that some of them, like Hope and Vanille, didn't get the screen time or depth they needed to feel like fully realized individuals. Hope, for example, is portrayed as a young, grieving boy coping with the loss of his mother, but his character arc is often overshadowed by his internal struggle and lack of agency within the story. Instead of seeing his growth unfold naturally, players are left with fragmented glimpses into his pain and frustration, making it difficult to fully connect with his transformation by the end of the game. Vanille, on the other hand, was a character many fans found polarizing. With her bright and bubbly personality, she was intended to balance the darker tones of the narrative, yet her lightheartedness sometimes felt out of place given the dire circumstances. Additionally, her backstory is critical to the game's overarching plot, but it unfolds so slowly that by the time players learn her true motivations, some may have already lost interest. Her hidden guilt and complex relationship with Fang, another key character, had the potential to add emotional layers, but this dynamic is underexplored, leaving players with questions rather than emotional payoffs. Even Lightning, the game's main protagonist, was a point of contention. Although she was positioned as a strong, determined leader, her personality was often seen as cold and distant. Her journey was largely one of inner resilience and stoicism. And while this contributed to her image as a strong female character, it also limited her relatability. Some fans argued that her arc lacked the vulnerability and emotional warmth needed to truly engage players. Unlike earlier Final Fantasy protagonists who often balance their strengths with personal flaws or moments of doubt, Lightning's reserved demeanor left some players feeling disconnected from her. While her motivations were clear, her journey rarely allowed players to see her growth in a nuanced or layered way, making it harder for fans to empathize with her struggles on a deeper level. This approach to character development left the cast feeling somewhat distant, as though players were observing them rather than truly experiencing their journeys. For a series known for its memorable, emotionally resonant characters, Final Fantasy XIII's cast felt more like archetypes than individuals with fully developed personalities and personal stakes. This lack of emotional depth made it harder for players to connect with the story and left many feeling that the character development fell short of the series' high standards. However, to simply criticize Final Fantasy XIII for its linearity and character issues would be unfair, because the game offers plenty of substance that deserves recognition. Let's start with the visuals. Released at the tail end of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era, Final Fantasy XIII was a technical marvel. The game's world, with its towering cities and vast landscapes, still stands as one of the most visually impressive environments in RPG history. The developers created a universe that felt futuristic yet organic, blending the mechanical with the natural in a way that made every area feel like a piece of art. Each environment was crafted to inspire awe and immerse players in the story's grand scale. Grand Pulse, for example, represents a dramatic shift from the enclosed, claustrophobic spaces of Cocoon. After spending hours traveling through linear corridors and restrictive pathways, players are finally introduced to this vast open area, a moment that almost feels like a reward for sticking with the journey. The freedom and sheer scale of Grand Pulse gives players a taste of what the world could have been from the beginning, allowing for exploration, monster hunts, and discovering hidden secrets. It's a space that truly comes to life, with towering beasts roaming freely and landscapes that stretch as far as the eye can see, providing a sense of wonder and freedom that had been missing up to this point. This openness was a refreshing change, creating a sense of discovery as players set foot in a world that feels alive and untamed. The beauty of Grand Pulse lies not just in its vastness, but in the way it allows players to approach challenges on their own terms. For a brief moment, Final Fantasy XIII echoes the earlier Final Fantasy games, giving players a chance to explore, strategize, and interact with the environment on a more personal level. The experience of Grand Pulse, with its sweeping landscapes and powerful enemies, serves as a reminder of what Final Fantasy XIII could achieve when it leaned into the series' strengths. Ultimately, this shift in design highlights the game's ambitious visuals, which were a technical feat at the time and remain stunning today. The attention to detail in each location, From the futuristic architecture of Cocoon to the rugged wilderness of Grand Pulse, demonstrates the dedication that went into crafting a visually unforgettable experience. Though the linearity and structure of the game were divisive, Final Fantasy XIII deserves recognition for pushing the boundaries of what an RPG could look like and setting a new standard for visual storytelling. Then there's the battle system. While it was certainly different from previous Final Fantasy titles, it wasn't necessarily worse. The paradigm shift system, where players strategically switch between different combat roles for their characters in real time, was innovative and brought a fresh twist to RPG battles. Rather than relying on a traditional turn-based approach, Final Fantasy XIII encouraged players to think on their feet. Each character could adopt different roles, such as Commando, Ravager, Medic, and Sentinel, which defined their function in battle. This system made combat feel fast-paced and tactical, rewarding players for adapting to enemy behavior and switching between paradigms or sets of roles on the fly. Every encounter demanded precision and timing, and while it wasn't as complex as the turn-based systems of old, it was undeniably engaging. For example, if an enemy suddenly started using powerful attacks, the player would need to quickly shift to a more defensive paradigm, utilizing roles like Sentinel to absorb damage. Then, in an instant, they could switch to an offensive paradigm to take advantage of an enemy's weakened state with roles like Commando and Ravager. The system had a rhythm and flow to it where mastering the timing of each paradigm shift could mean the difference between victory and defeat. This made combat feel more dynamic and interactive, giving players the sense that they were truly strategizing in real time. Despite these innovations, however, the lack of a deep open world exploration system meant that players couldn't really get lost in the world in the same way they could in previous titles. Without a rich world to roam freely, the emphasis on combat sometimes felt isolated, as though it existed separately from the broader story and world building that Final Fantasy fans were accustomed to. For some, this was a deal breaker, as they missed the immersive feeling of exploring every corner of a vast, mysterious world filled with hidden treasures, side quests, and story threads. But others appreciated the faster, more streamlined combat that Final Fantasy XIII offered, viewing it as a focused, intense experience that cut away any excess. This division in the fanbase highlighted a fundamental shift in the series' design philosophy. By prioritizing a faster, more action-oriented combat system over slower, methodical exploration, Final Fantasy XIII carved out a new identity within the franchise. It aimed to be a more cinematic, controlled experience, and for some players this change was refreshing. A streamlined adventure that offered high-octane battles without the downtime of backtracking or searching for hidden content. For others though, the lack of exploration and freedom felt like a step away from what had once made Final Fantasy so captivating. The paradigm shift system may not have won over everyone, but it undeniably brought a new energy to RPG combat that was exhilarating in its own right. Here's the interesting twist. Despite all the criticisms, there's a surprising amount of love for Final Fantasy XIII. In fact, for some fans, it ranks as one of their favorite entries in the franchise. A common argument is that 13 features one of the strongest narratives in the series, delving into themes of destiny, rebellion, and the fight for free will. The story challenges its characters and players to grapple with questions of agency and the consequences of defying seemingly insurmountable forces. The characters, while initially seen as flat by some, undergo deep personal growth that resonates powerfully by the end of their journeys. Take Snow for example. At first he may seem like a brash, overly idealistic heroic archetype, but his arc is far more nuanced. His journey explores the weight of sacrifice, the danger of blind optimism, and the painful realization that his actions, no matter how well intentioned, can have devastating consequences. Snow's struggle with guilt and responsibility adds layers to a character who initially comes across as one-dimensional. Lightning too evolves in meaningful ways. Introduced as a cold, fiercely independent soldier, she embodies strength and determination. But her growth lies in learning to trust others and accept vulnerability as a source of power. Her relationship with her sister Sarah drives much of her motivation, but it's her bond with the rest of the party that ultimately reshapes her character, turning her into a leader who values connection over isolation. Similarly, characters like Saz, whose story tackles themes of loss and resilience, and Fang and Vanille, whose shared history and sacrifice form the emotional backbone of the narrative, add depth and emotional complexity to the group dynamic. Admittedly, the plot can feel convoluted at first, with terms like l'Cie, Fal'Cie, and Seath thrown around with little initial context, but for those willing to engage with the lore, the story reveals itself as an intricate tapestry of interwoven destinies and emotional stakes. At its heart, it's about perseverance, overcoming personal flaws, challenging oppressive systems, and finding hope even in the darkest of circumstances. The twists, revelations, and the final confrontation with the game's true antagonist feel earned, and for many fans, this payoff is what makes Final Fantasy XIII so special. And despite the criticism of its linearity, some players appreciated the tightly focused narrative structure. By removing sprawling open-world distractions, the game allows players to immerse themselves fully in the story and its characters. This focus creates an experience akin to reading a gripping novel where every scene drives the narrative forward and the momentum rarely falters. It's a stark contrast to the more open-ended entries in the series, but for fans of Final Fantasy XIII, this streamlined approach is what makes it stand out. They argue that the criticism of linearity often overlooks how effectively the game tells its story without unnecessary detours. For these players, the clarity and intensity of XIII's narrative are what make it shine, proving that a linear structure, when done right, can deliver an equally compelling RPG experience. So does Final Fantasy XIII deserve its bad reputation? The answer isn't as clear-cut as it might seem. While its linear structure and uneven character development in the early stages alienated many players, those who pushed through often discovered a game with surprising depth. Its emotionally charged narrative, innovative combat system, and breathtaking visuals showcased the ambition of a team willing to take bold risks. Not all of those risks paid off, but that doesn't mean the game was a failure. If anything, Final Fantasy XIII is a testament to how the franchise has always sought to evolve, even if it meant dividing its fanbase. In the end, Final Fantasy XIII is a flawed yet ambitious title, one that dared to carve its own identity in a series known for reinvention. For its fans, it's an underrated gem with a unique charm that makes it worth revisiting even years later. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Did Final Fantasy XIII live up to its potential, or do you agree with its critics? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more content, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.